Have you ever wondered why some people recover from illness so quickly, while others struggle for years? Why some seem to glow with energy and vitality, even when life throws endless challenges their way? The answer, surprisingly, may not always be found in medicine, surgeries, or expensive treatments. Instead, it lies in something we carry with us every moment of our lives: the incredible, untapped power of the human mind. For centuries, healers, monks, and philosophers have whispered the same truth. The mind is not separate from the body. What you think, what you believe, even the quiet conversations you have with yourself, all leave a mark deep inside your cells. Science now confirms what ancient wisdom has taught all along. Your thoughts can change the chemistry of your body. Your beliefs can shift how your brain communicates with your immune system. And the way you direct your attention has the potential to speed up healing, reduce pain, and even save your life. It almost sounds like magic, doesn't it? But it's not magic. It's the forgotten science of mind-body connection, waiting for us to rediscover it. Imagine for a moment that every thought you create is like a signal, traveling through invisible wires, instantly telling your body how to respond. When you're afraid, your body tenses, your heart races, your immune defenses weaken. But when you're calm, confident, and filled with trust, your body softens, your systems align, and healing begins naturally. We live in a world that constantly tells us the answer is out there. Another pill, another therapy, another fix. And yes, medicine has saved countless lives. But what if the most powerful medicine has always been within you? What if you had the ability to awaken something extraordinary without swallowing a single tablet? There are countless stories of people who overcame the impossible, who walked away from the shadow of illness by harnessing the sheer force of their mind. Doctors call it the placebo effect. Spiritual teachers call it faith. Psychologists call it belief. But whatever name you give it, the essence is the same. When your mind believes in healing, your body listens. And here is the part that most people overlook. This power doesn't belong to a chosen few. It doesn't require special training or years of meditation in a monastery. It's already inside you, quietly waiting, like a dormant seed ready to grow when you nourish it with the right thoughts, the right emotions, and the right kind of focus. Think about this. Every time you experience joy, your body produces chemicals that strengthen your heart, protect your brain, and lift your immunity. Every time you practice gratitude, your nervous system relaxes, and your cells begin to repair. On the other hand, when you're stuck in fear, anger, or constant stress, your body can literally forget how to heal itself. It begins to fight against you instead of for you. This is why awakening the power of your mind is not just a spiritual idea, it's survival. It's the difference between a life controlled by fear and sickness and a life guided by resilience, vitality, and peace. So, as we begin this journey together, I invite you to pause for a moment. Take a deep breath. Feel the air enter your lungs, feel your chest expand, and realize this simple truth. Every breath you take is proof that life is still with you, that your body is still listening. The question is, what will you choose to tell it? In the pages ahead, we'll explore the mysteries of belief, the science of healing, and the practices that can turn ordinary thoughts into extraordinary medicine. You'll see how the mind can be both your greatest healer and your greatest enemy, and how you can train it to serve you, not sabotage you. This is not about rejecting medicine or science. It's about reclaiming the part of healing that most of us have forgotten, the part that makes you the author of your own well-being. Your mind holds a power far beyond what you've been taught, and the moment you begin to trust it, truly trust it, everything can change. What if I told you that sometimes the very thing that heals you isn't the medicine itself, but your belief in it? Imagine being handed a small pill, told that it will relieve your pain, restore your energy, and bring back your strength. You swallow it with hope, and soon, almost miraculously, your body begins to respond. The pain eases, the fatigue fades, and your health improves. Later, you discover that the pill was nothing more than sugar. No drugs, no chemicals, nothing but faith. This is the mystery of the placebo effect. a phenomenon so powerful that it has shaken the foundations of modern medicine. Doctors have seen it again and again. Patients improve, wounds heal, and symptoms vanish, not because of the treatment itself, but because the patient believed they were receiving real help. It sounds unbelievable, yet it happens every day in clinical trials. Two groups of patients receive treatment. One gets the real drug, the other gets a placebo. Again and again, researchers find that a surprising number of people in the placebo group still get better. Their bodies respond as if the treatment were real. Their minds, in essence, created the cure. But how? How can something as intangible as belief change the very biology of the body? Neuroscience gives us a clue. When you believe that you are healing, your brain begins to release chemicals, endorphins, dopamine, even natural painkillers, that mirror the effects of actual medicine. Your immune system becomes more alert, your stress levels drop, and your body activates its natural repair mechanisms. What you believe, your body translates into biology. It's as though the mind writes a prescription and the body fills it. And perhaps what's most fascinating is that the placebo effect doesn't just work for minor issues. It's been recorded in cases of chronic pain, depression, high blood pressure, even Parkinson's disease. Patients who thought they were receiving a groundbreaking treatment began to show genuine physical improvement, even though the treatment was inert. Their minds became their pharmacy, their belief the most potent medicine of all. Think about what this means for your own life. If belief alone can reduce pain, lower stress, and speed recovery, then every thought you choose carries weight. Every belief you cultivate is like a seed, planted in the soil of your body. Some seeds grow into healing, others into harm. Which ones are you watering? The placebo effect reminds us of a forgotten truth. We are not powerless patients waiting for something external to save us. We are active participants in our own healing. The stories we tell ourselves, the trust we place in our recovery, and the hope we refuse to abandon, they all shape how our bodies respond. And yet, this power is often dismissed as though it were a trick or a lie. But think about it. If the outcome is real, if the pain disappears, if the body heals, does it matter how it happened? Isn't healing still healing? The placebo effect is not weakness. It is proof that your body listens to your mind more closely than you realize. It shows you that your beliefs are not just fleeting thoughts. They are blueprints that the body follows. Now imagine this. If belief in a sugar pill can awaken such profound changes, what could happen if you deliberately trained your mind to believe in your own strength? What if you chose, every single day, to plant seeds of health, resilience, and vitality? What if you stopped waiting for healing to arrive from the outside, and instead awakened the pharmacy that already exists within you? Because here is the deeper secret. Placebo is not a trick played on the patient. It is a mirror reflecting the mind's natural ability to heal, a glimpse into what happens when belief and biology align. And just as belief can awaken healing, disbelief or fear can awaken the opposite. The mind has two faces, one that restores and one that destroys. To understand the light, we must also face the shadow. If belief has the power to heal, then disbelief has the power to destroy. Just as the placebo effect can unlock the body's hidden pharmacy, there is another, darker force at play, one that quietly sabotages our health, not with medicine but with fear. This is known as the Nocebo effect. Picture this. A patient is told that a treatment may cause nausea. Hours later, the patient begins to feel sick, even though the treatment they received was only a harmless sugar pill. Another person is warned that a certain medication might cause headaches. Soon after, headaches appear not because of the drug but because of expectation. The mind once again writes a prescription, but this time the body fills it with suffering. This is the shadow twin of placebo, the nocebo effect, and it reveals something sobering. Your body doesn't distinguish between a belief that uplifts and a belief that harms. It listens to both. It obeys both. When your mind whispers fear, your body follows just as faithfully as it follows hope. Think about how often this happens in daily life. A doctor delivers a diagnosis, And instead of hope, the words ignite despair. You only have 6 months. Those words can sink deeper than the illness itself. Countless cases have shown patients deteriorating quickly after such predictions, not because their bodies were ready to shut down, but because their minds believed it was inevitable. Or consider stress. If you constantly tell yourself, "I'm exhausted, I'm overwhelmed, I'm falling apart," your body hears those words as commands. It begins to mirror them. Tension rises, immunity drops, energy drains. Fear, anxiety, and hopelessness are powerful drugs, and they are toxic. The nocebo effect is a warning. It shows us that our thoughts are never neutral. Every thought carries weight, shaping the chemistry of our body. Just as joy produces healing hormones, fear produces poison. Just as trust strengthens the immune system, doubt weakens it. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this: nocebo doesn't require truth. It only requires belief. Even if the danger isn't real, your mind makes it real. A harmless pill becomes poison. A neutral word becomes a sentence. A passing worry becomes an illness. But there is also a gift hidden in this shadow. If your mind is powerful enough to harm you, then it is also powerful enough to free you. Recognizing the nocebo effect is the first step toward breaking it. It is the moment you realize, I don't have to believe every fearful thought. I don't have to accept every negative story. I can choose what to feed my body through my mind. The truth is, you are not just the receiver of thoughts, you are the author of them. And when you choose consciously, when you begin to direct your beliefs toward healing rather than harm, your body will follow. This is why awareness is everything. To see your thoughts clearly is to break their spell. To notice fear is to weaken its grip. To replace it with trust, gratitude, or even curiosity is to begin tilting your body back toward health. So if placebo reveals the light within you, nocebo reveals the shadow. Both are real, both are powerful, and both are waiting for you to decide which one will guide your life. But knowing this alone is not enough, because there is one force that quietly fuels the nocebo effect more than anything else. A force most of us live with every day, often without realizing the damage it causes. That force is stress. If fear can plant seeds of sickness, then stress is the storm that keeps them alive. Stress is invisible, but its fingerprints are everywhere on your heart, your breath, your sleep, your thoughts. It is the constant tension humming in the background of modern life, so common that many of us mistake it for normal. But here is the hidden truth. Prolonged stress doesn't just make you uncomfortable. It blocks your body's ability to heal. Think about what happens when you feel threatened. Your body instantly switches into survival mode. Your heart races, your blood pressure rises, your muscles tighten, and your brain becomes hyper-focused on danger. This is known as the fight or flight response, and in short bursts, it's a gift. It's what kept our ancestors alive in the face of predators. But in today's world, the predators are not lions or tigers. They are deadlines, bills, arguments, uncertainty, and endless noise. And unlike ancient threats, these don't pass quickly. They follow you home. They crawl into your bed. They linger in your mind day after day. When stress never leaves, your body stays trapped in survival mode. The immune system weakens. Digestion slows. Cells stop repairing themselves. Your body begins to burn out, not because it's broken, but because it's been running from an invisible tiger for years. This is why chronic stress is often called a silent killer. It doesn't strike all at once. It chips away slowly, making you more vulnerable to illness, disease, and exhaustion. It robs you of the very energy your body needs to recover. But here's the hopeful part. The same system that locks you into survival can also unlock your natural ability to heal. The switch is in your breath, your awareness, your choice to pause. When you take a deep, conscious breath, when you let your shoulders drop and your body soften, you are sending a signal to your nervous system. The danger has passed. It's safe to heal now. Science has proven this again and again. Practices like meditation, mindfulness, yoga, or even a simple walk in nature lower cortisol, the stress hormone, while increasing serotonin and dopamine, the chemicals of peace and well-being. Within minutes, your heart slows, your blood pressure stabilizes, and your immune system reawakens. It doesn't require hours of practice. Sometimes it takes only one mindful breath, fully felt, to begin shifting the body back into balance. That single pause is like telling your inner pharmacy to open its doors again. Stress teaches us an important lesson. Healing cannot happen in survival mode. You cannot repair while you are running from fear. You cannot restore while your body believes it's in danger. To heal, you must create space for safety, for calm, for stillness. This is why ancient traditions placed so much emphasis on silence, prayer, and meditation. They understood something science is only beginning to explain, that the mind state dictates the body's state, that calmness is not a luxury but a medicine. So ask yourself, how much of your life is being lived in survival? How many of your days are consumed by stress that keeps your body locked away from its natural wisdom? And more importantly, what would happen if you gave yourself permission to pause, even for just a few minutes each day? Because when you do, something remarkable begins. The storms of stress begin to clear, and beneath them, the soil of self-healing becomes fertile once again. Your body remembers what it has always known: how to restore, how to repair, how to renew. And once stress loosens its grip, the deeper intelligence of the mind can finally be heard. The same intelligence that turns belief into biology, the same intelligence that makes healing possible. It is here, in this calmer state, that we begin to see how thoughts themselves shape our health, not just emotionally, but physically. When the storm of stress begins to quiet, something extraordinary happens. The mind, once drowned out by noise, begins to reveal its true power. And this power is not abstract, it's biological. Neuroscience now confirms what spiritual traditions have whispered for centuries. Your thoughts shape your body, not metaphorically, literally. Every thought is not just an idea floating in space. It's a spark of electricity firing between neurons. It creates chemical messengers, neurotransmitters, that ripple through your nervous system, influencing hormones, heart rate, digestion, and even how your genes express themselves. Think about it. When you recall a painful memory, your body doesn't just remember. Your heart rate quickens, your muscles tense, maybe even tears rise. The memory becomes physical. The same is true with joy. When you think of a loved one or a moment of laughter, your body responds with warmth, with calm, with a smile that wasn't there a second ago. Now imagine what happens when belief is sustained, not just a passing thought, but a conviction. The brain rewires itself around that belief. Neural pathways strengthen, hormones adjust. Your entire biology begins to reflect that inner state. This is the science behind the placebo effect, but it goes even deeper. Functional MRI scans show that when people believe a treatment will help them, the brain releases endorphins, the body's natural painkillers. Blood flow changes in regions associated with healing and resilience. The body behaves as though the medicine were real, even when it's not. Why? Because the brain cannot distinguish between a vividly believed thought and an external reality. This is where Buddhism's teaching on mind over matter meets neuroscience. The Buddha said, "What we think, we become." Modern science translates this into neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change itself based on repeated patterns of thought. If your inner dialogue is filled with despair, the brain wires itself for more despair. Stress chemicals flood your system, weakening your immune response. But if your inner voice speaks of possibility, of resilience, of healing, your brain wires itself differently. It strengthens networks of calm, safety, and restoration. Here's an example. A study on Parkinson's patients showed that those who believed they were receiving effective treatment, even when they were given nothing more than a sugar pill, produced higher levels of dopamine, the very chemical they were deficient in. Their belief literally filled the gap their brain could not. Another study on pain revealed that when people expected relief, the brain's pain circuits dimmed, and their perception of pain decreased. Belief didn't just change their mood. It changed the firing of neurons, the flow of chemicals, the lived reality of their body. This is why healing begins not in the body but in the mind. Your biology is listening to every thought you repeat, every story you tell yourself, every belief you hold. But let's be honest. Belief is not always easy. You can't just snap your fingers and declare, "I believe I am healed," while inside you feel broken. The brain knows the difference between shallow affirmations and deep conviction. Real belief grows through practice, through evidence, through repeated moments of alignment between thought and body. Buddhism offers a path here. Meditation is not just about silence. It is about training the mind to return, again and again, to a state of clarity. Over time, this practice reshapes the brain itself. MRI scans of long-term meditators show thicker regions in areas responsible for attention, compassion, and emotional regulation. Their brains are physically transformed by practice. In a way, meditation is belief in motion. Every time you return to the breath, you affirm, "I can be here. I can be whole. I can choose peace." And the brain responds, slowly building highways of calm where once there were only paths of stress. So the question becomes, what story are you repeating inside your mind? What beliefs are you feeding your brain every day? Because whether you realize it or not, your body is already obeying them. If you believe you are falling apart, your biology follows. But if you believe, even imperfectly, that you are in the process of healing, your biology also follows. The brain listens, the cells listen, and over time they align with the song you choose to sing within. This is the miracle of neuroscience meeting wisdom. The mind is not just a passenger in healing, it is the driver. And when you learn to guide it with awareness, belief becomes the most powerful medicine you will ever know. And yet, there is another layer. Because while belief can heal, suppressed emotions can just as powerfully harm. What the mind hides, the body remembers. And to truly unlock healing, we must dare to face what we've been holding inside. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself standing in a peaceful meadow. The air is fresh, the sunlight warm but gentle, and you can hear the soft rustle of leaves around you. Now, picture your body. Strong, vibrant, free of pain or illness. See your cells working together in harmony, your heart steady, your breath calm. This is not just daydreaming. This is visualization, one of the most profound tools your mind has to influence your reality. Science has shown us something remarkable. When you vividly imagine a physical action, your brain lights up as though you were actually performing it. Athletes have long used this to sharpen their skills. Basketball players rehearsing free throws in their minds, gymnasts running entire routines without ever moving a muscle. And astonishingly, their performance improves as if they had trained physically. Why? Because the brain doesn't fully distinguish between what is vividly imagined and what is lived. When you apply this to healing, you tap into the same power. Visualizing your body repairing itself, your immune system getting stronger, your energy returning. It's like sending signals to your entire system. This is what health looks like. This is what we are moving toward. Over time, these mental rehearsals can influence real, measurable changes in your body. There's a story of cancer patients who were guided through visualization exercises, picturing their white blood cells as powerful warriors fighting off disease. Many reported not only feeling calmer and more in control, but also experiencing improvements in recovery and resilience. Visualization doesn't replace medical treatment, but it amplifies it by recruiting your own inner forces. The key is vividness and emotion. It's not about vaguely thinking, "I want to be healthy." It's about painting the scene in your mind with rich detail. What does it look like? What does it feel like? What emotions rise up when you imagine yourself already healed? The stronger the emotional charge, the deeper the brain encodes that vision as reality. But visualization is not just for healing illness. It's also a daily practice of aligning your mind with your highest possibilities. Imagine waking up each morning and seeing yourself moving through the day with calmness, strength, and joy. When challenges arise, you've already rehearsed your response in your mind. grounded, patient, resilient. By the time life tests you, your nervous system is prepared as though it has walked this path before. Here's a simple exercise you can try. Sit quietly, close your eyes, and take 3 slow breaths. Then choose one area of your body or one aspect of your life you wish to improve. See it clearly. If it's your health, picture your cells glowing with vitality. If it's your mood, imagine your heart expanding with lightness and ease. Stay with this image for 5 to 10 minutes, letting it feel as real as possible. End with gratitude as if it has already happened. Bit by bit, visualization begins to shift your inner landscape. And when your inner world changes, your outer world follows. This is the silent magic of your mind at work, not forced, not frantic, but quietly shaping the future with images you choose to believe in. And as we explore deeper, we'll see that visualization is only one doorway into the profound connection between thought and body. There are other practices, equally powerful, that awaken the same hidden potential inside you. They show us that the mind is not just an observer of life. It is a co-creator of life itself. Listen closely, not to the world outside, but to the voice that whispers inside your mind. That quiet narrator, the one commenting on your choices, your struggles, your dreams, this is your self-talk. And whether you realize it or not, it shapes the very fabric of your reality. Think of it this way. Every word you speak to yourself is like a seed planted in the soil of your subconscious. Nurtured often enough, those seeds grow into beliefs, and those beliefs become the lens through which you see the world. If your inner voice is harsh, critical, or filled with doubt, then your inner garden grows weeds of fear and limitation. But if your self-talk is compassionate, encouraging, and grounded in truth, it blossoms into resilience, courage, and healing. Modern psychology has confirmed what ancient wisdom always knew. Words carry energy. Neuroscientists have found that repetitive self-talk can literally rewire neural pathways, strengthening either destructive patterns or empowering ones. For instance, telling yourself, "I'm always sick, I'll never get better," sends signals to your nervous system that reinforce weakness and stress. But shifting that to "my body is healing, I'm growing stronger each day," triggers your brain to release chemicals that support recovery and calm. There's a famous experiment with athletes where half of the group practiced positive self-talk before competitions while the other half did not. The results? Those who spoke to themselves with confidence and encouragement performed significantly better, even though their physical abilities were the same. Why? Because their inner voice acted like an invisible coach, unlocking a higher level of performance that doubt would have crushed. Now imagine this applied to healing. If every day you remind yourself gently but firmly, "I am safe, my body knows how to repair, my mind is calm," you're not just repeating empty phrases. You are training your nervous system to choose peace over panic, health over harm. Slowly, the mind begins to believe and the body follows. But here's the truth. Changing self-talk isn't about denying reality or faking happiness. It's not about plastering over wounds with forced positivity. It's about choosing words that empower rather than imprison. If you're tired, you can say, "I'm exhausted, I can't handle this." Or you can shift it to, "I'm giving my body the rest it deserves, and I trust my energy will return." Both statements acknowledge the same truth, but one drains you while the other uplifts you. A simple practice you can begin today is becoming aware of the tone of your inner voice. Notice when it turns against you, when it repeats patterns of judgment or fear. Then pause, ask yourself, "Would I say this to someone I love?" If the answer is no, reframe it. Speak to yourself as you would to a dear friend, with kindness, patience, and belief in their strength. Some people even use affirmations written on sticky notes, placed on mirrors, doors, or bedside tables, so the words become daily companions. Others record their own encouraging voice and listen before sleep, letting those words sink deeply into the subconscious. The method doesn't matter as much as the intention, to make your inner language an ally, not an enemy. Over time, self-talk becomes more than just words. It becomes the background music of your life. And when that music is harmonious, filled with encouragement and hope, it strengthens every part of your being. Because at the heart of it, your inner voice is always listening. And the question is, will you let it echo fear, or will you teach it to speak healing? And as this inner dialogue grows gentler, more powerful, it opens the way for another practice, one that has carried humans across centuries of suffering into peace, the art of meditation, where silence itself becomes the greatest healer. Imagine for a moment that your life is a wheel. Each spoke represents an aspect of your existence: your diet, your sleep, your movement, your relationships, your spiritual practice, your inner peace. When one spoke weakens or breaks, the wheel wobbles. But when every spoke is strong, the wheel turns smoothly, carrying you forward with ease. This is the essence of a holistic lifestyle, honoring the whole, not just the parts. Too often, we treat health like a battle fought on a single front. We think if we just take the right pill, eat the right food, or do the right exercise, everything will fall into place. But healing doesn't work that way. The body, the mind, and the spirit are woven together like threads of the same fabric. Tug on one and the whole design shifts. Neglect one and the whole system suffers. A holistic lifestyle begins with awareness. What do you feed not only your body, but also your mind and soul? Food matters, of course, fresh, natural, nourishing meals that fuel vitality rather than drain it. But so do the foods of thought. The conversations you have, the media you consume, the words you repeat to yourself each day. Junk food poisons the body, but toxic thoughts poison the spirit. Both leave you depleted, both require cleansing. Sleep, too, is a cornerstone. In a world that glorifies busyness, rest is often treated like a luxury. But in truth, sleep is sacred medicine. It's when your body repairs, your brain resets, your soul drifts through realms of quiet restoration. Deprive yourself of this, and no amount of supplements or positive thinking can compensate. Give yourself this gift, and you awaken stronger, more resilient, ready to meet the day. Movement is another key. Not just strenuous exercise, but the kind of movement that feels like play, that connects you back to your body's natural rhythm. Walks in nature, stretching with awareness, dancing when no one is watching. These are not luxuries. They are reminders that your body is meant to flow, not stagnate. And then there are your relationships. Who surrounds you? Do they uplift you or drain you? A holistic lifestyle means nurturing connections that bring warmth and letting go of those that poison your spirit. Love and compassion are not extras. They are nutrients, as vital to your well-being as air and water. But perhaps the deepest layer of a holistic life is alignment. Living in harmony with your values, your purpose, your inner truth. Too many people wear masks, chasing goals that don't belong to them, silencing their hearts for the sake of approval. This inner conflict is one of the greatest causes of suffering. When your actions align with your truth, however, a profound peace enters your life. Healing becomes not something you chase, but something that naturally unfolds. There's a Zen teaching that says, when you drink tea, just drink tea. When you walk, just walk. When you work, just work. A holistic life is not about adding endless rituals or rules. It's about presence, about living each moment as if it mattered, because it does. A practical way to begin is to do a gentle inventory. Ask yourself, what am I feeding my body? What am I feeding my mind? What am I feeding my spirit? Write it down. Notice where you feel imbalance. And then, instead of drastic changes, choose small shifts. Replace one toxic habit with one nourishing habit. Bit by bit, the wheel strengthens. And as your life becomes more whole, you discover something extraordinary. Healing isn't just about curing disease. It's about living in a way that prevents disease in the first place. It's about building resilience so that when challenges come, as they always do, you meet them not with panic but with quiet strength. Because in the end, a holistic lifestyle is not a rigid program. It's an art, a dance of balance. And when lived fully, it doesn't just heal the body, it heals the way you experience life itself. And yet, there's one more piece that ties everything together: gratitude. That simple but profound shift in perception that transforms every moment into a source of healing. For centuries, science and spirituality were seen as opposites, two paths walking away from each other. Science demanded evidence, numbers, measurements. Spirituality spoke of faith, intuition, and mysteries that could not be seen. But today, something extraordinary is happening. These two worlds are no longer at war. They are slowly recognizing they have been describing the same truth, only in different languages. Think of meditation. For thousands of years, monks and mystics taught that sitting in silence could transform the mind and heal the body. To the scientific world of the past, this sounded like superstition. Yet modern neuroscience now shows how meditation lowers stress hormones, reshapes brain structure, strengthens immunity, and even slows aging at the cellular level. What once belonged to the realm of spirit is now validated by the most advanced machines scanning the human brain. Or take prayer and intention. People of faith have long believed that sincere prayer brings comfort and even healing. Scientists studied this through the lens of psychoneuroimmunology and discovered something astonishing. When people pray, or when others pray for them, their stress decreases, their bodies relax, and their capacity to heal improves. Whether you call it divine grace or the body's relaxation response, the result is the same. Faith and physiology intertwine. Placebo itself is perhaps the clearest bridge. Doctors once dismissed it as fake medicine, but research shows that belief can trigger the brain to release real endorphins, dopamine, and immune boosters. In other words, faith is not separate from biology, it becomes biology. What spiritual teachers called the power of belief now has charts, data, and scientific journals confirming it. Quantum physics takes the union even further. At the smallest level of reality, particles behave not as solid objects but as probabilities, responding to observation, shifting with intention. It echoes ancient teachings that reality is shaped by consciousness. When physicists talk about the observer effect, they echo what sages whispered, that our awareness participates in creating the world around us. But here's the most beautiful part. Science doesn't diminish the mystery of spirituality, it deepens it. The more we discover, the more we realize how vast the unknown still is. We can map the brain's response to meditation, but can we explain the peace that arises from sitting still? We can measure hormones released during gratitude, but can we capture the joy of a heart that feels thankful for simply being alive? This meeting point between science and spirit is not about proving one right and the other wrong. It's about seeing them as partners, each offering tools the other lacks. Science gives us precision, structure, and validation. Spirituality gives us meaning, purpose, and connection. Together, they form a bridge wide enough to carry us into a new way of understanding healing, one that honors both the measurable and the mysterious. And when you live from this place, where your practices are rooted in evidence and enriched by faith, you no longer have to choose between reason and intuition. You stand at the center, where both worlds meet, and from there, your healing becomes whole. And so, as we reach the end of this journey, there remains one final piece to complete the circle. The closing reflection, the out-row, where we bring all these insights together and step into a life guided by the power of mind, body, and spirit as one. As our journey draws to a close, pause for a moment and reflect on what you've just discovered. From the mysteries of the placebo effect, to the hidden dangers of the nocebo, from the stress that weakens us, to the self-talk that strengthens us, a pattern has emerged, and it points to one profound truth. The greatest medicine you will ever know does not come from a bottle, a machine, or even a doctor's hands. It comes from within you. Your mind is not just a bystander in your life. It is the architect. Every thought, every belief, every word you whisper to yourself writes instructions into your body. Visualization paints the future before it happens. Meditation carves out stillness where chaos once ruled. Gratitude transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary, and a holistic life keeps the wheel of your being balanced and strong. Science has shown us the mechanics. Spirituality has shown us the meaning. Together, they reveal what sages and scientists now both agree on. You are not powerless. You are not at the mercy of fate. You hold the key every single day in how you choose to think, feel, and act. Does this mean life will never bring illness, grief, or hardship? Of course not. Being human is to walk through valleys as well as peaks, but it does mean that you are never without power. Even in the darkest moments, your mind can be the light that guides you. Even in weakness, your spirit can awaken strength you never knew was there. So the question is not, do you have the power? You already do. The real question is, will you use it? Will you choose to see yourself not as a victim of circumstances, but as a co-creator of your own healing? Will you feed your inner voice words that lift instead of crush? Will you live each day in alignment, gratitude, and awareness? The choice is yours. The key has always been in your hands, and the door it opens is nothing less than the fullness of life, health, peace, resilience, and the freedom to live as the truest version of yourself. Take a deep breath right now. Feel it filling your chest, flowing through your body. That breath is proof of your power, a reminder that in this very moment you are alive, you are capable, and you are more than enough. Carry this truth with you, not just as knowledge, but as practice. Let it guide how you wake in the morning, how you move through your day, and how you rest at night. For in the end, the secret isn't hidden in some distant place. The secret is you. And now, as you step forward from here, remember, the healing you seek, the strength you desire, the peace you long for, none of it lies outside. The key has always been within you, and it always will be. As our journey draws to a close, pause for a moment and reflect on what you've just discovered. From the mysteries of the placebo effect, to the hidden dangers of the nocebo, from the stress that weakens us, to the self-talk that strengthens us, a pattern has emerged. And it points to one profound truth. The greatest medicine you will ever know does not come from a bottle, a machine, or even a doctor's hands. It comes from within you. Your mind is not just a bystander in your life. It is the architect. Every thought, every belief, every word you whisper to yourself writes instructions into your body. Visualization paints the future before it happens. Meditation carves out stillness where chaos once ruled. Gratitude transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary, and a holistic life keeps the wheel of your being balanced and strong. Science has shown us the mechanics. Spirituality has shown us the meaning. Together, they reveal what sages and scientists now both agree on. You are not powerless. You are not at the mercy of fate. You hold the key every single day in how you choose to think, feel, and act. Does this mean life will never bring illness, grief, or hardship? Of course not. Being human is to walk through valleys as well as peaks, but it does mean that you are never without power. Even in the darkest moments, your mind can be the light that guides you. Even in weakness, your spirit can awaken strength you never knew was there. So the question is not, do you have the power? You already do. The real question is, will you use it? Will you choose to see yourself not as a victim of circumstances, but as a co-creator of your own healing? Will you feed your inner voice words that lift instead of crush? Will you live each day in alignment, gratitude, and awareness? The choice is yours. The key has always been in your hands, and the door it opens is nothing less than the fullness of life, health, peace, resilience, and the freedom to live as the truest version of yourself. Take a deep breath right now. Feel it filling your chest, flowing through your body. That breath is proof of your power, a reminder that in this very moment you are alive, you are capable, and you are more than enough. Carry this truth with you, not just as knowledge, but as practice. Let it guide how you wake in the morning, how you move through your day, and how you rest at night. For in the end, the secret isn't hidden in some distant place. The secret is you. And now, as you step forward from here, remember, the healing you seek, the strength you desire, the peace you long for, none of it lies outside. The key has always been within you, and it always will be. If what you've just heard touched something deep inside you, let this be the beginning, not the end. At Zen Buddhism Wisdom, we share teachings, stories, and reflections that remind us of the peace already living in our own hearts. If this message resonates with you, I invite you to subscribe, to join this growing community of seekers walking the same path. Together, we can nurture mindfulness, compassion, and the courage to live fully in each moment. And if you feel called, share this with someone who might need it today. Sometimes a single word, a single teaching can open a door that's been closed for years. Thank you for listening, for being present, and for walking this path with us. Until next time, may you be well, may you be peaceful, and may you always remember, the key has always been within you.